live, and it says this Hangout is on air and is live. So hello, welcome everybody to the, I've lost count, it must be the 5th or 6th Hangout that we've done since the start of 2016. For those of you that are wondering why we've done 5 or 6, at HT2 we're running a year-long course, a year-long MOOC, a massive open online course. Every month of this year, we're looking at a different topic, subject, tool, technology, and roughly towards the end of that month, we're kind of unpacking it a bit and we're hosting a live event, be it a hangout like this or a Twitter chat, to just bring some people together and chat about that subject in a bit more detail. When I say bring some people together, I normally mean more than just me and the guy that I've asked to drop into the Hangout, which is unfortunately what we've got tonight. Quite bizarrely, we just got the two of us. So without wishing to kind of trash the whole plan, I'm going to crack on with the Hangout. I'm going to introduce Owen very, very shortly, and we're going to crack on with the questions. And hopefully people might drop in as we're doing that. If they don't, then at least it's out there as a video resource for people to tap into. So let's get started. I know very few organizations that research and study and learn from what they do as a business. Both learn from that internally, but also share what they've learned with others. I work for one of the organizations, HT2, and I'm pleased to say that I've got Owen Ferguson on from Good Practice, who's the other organization that immediately springs to my mind. The last business that I worked in, the fact that they are so research focused in what they do and can validate their decisions around the content they use and the platform that the content is hosted in, the rationale behind all that was a key factor in me being able to partner with them and being able to bring them on board as a provider in my last business. So I'll stop prattling on. Owen, do you want to give us a brief insight into who you are and what you do at Good Practice?
Thanks, Craig. Good to be here. What do? We provide a wide range of learning solutions aimed specifically or mostly at people who are in people management positions. So we concentrate very much on that target audience, and we cover off the kind of whole gamut of online learning, everything from sort of performance support toolkit, which provides resources to across a wide range of management challenges, through to more traditional, I wouldn't necessarily say traditional e-learning, but more traditional e-learning interventions and sort of formal programs. My role in that has been, until relatively recently, I looked after the product development side of the business. So I was responsible for developing our core products and services, and also initiating a lot of the research that we do carry out to kind of back up the decisions that we make for developing those products.
So you've mentioned the word research there. Go on. Give us a couple of examples of what you've done really recently. I know that we're going to be working together around an element of that, but also I mentioned in my intro about the research that you do into the platform that you host the content on. So do you want to give us an insight into kind of what you do behind the scenes to make sure that your content and your platform meets what the research is suggesting?
Sure. So I mean, we do all sorts of research. Sorry, I'm just getting a little bit of feedback there. Give myself a second delayed. Most of the research that we carry out is for purely selfish reasons, because the main aim of the research that we carry out is to develop, refine, and improve the products and services that we carry out. And every now and then we produce a piece of research, or we carry out a piece of research that we think would be of interest to the wider learning development community, and then we sort of package that up in an easily digestible format, try and remove most of the sums, and then summarize it in a way that we think is particularly useful. And the reason that we carry out that research is to remove our own bias. The question that we ask ourselves is, how can we best uncover the real challenges, aspirations, and habits of the people that we are creating solutions for? So we do things like we carry out wide-ranging surveys of employee populations that we serve. We carry out in-depth interviews, which we then we transcribe them and subject them to text analysis tools, and we pick out themes from that, which we can then test using other surveys. We carry out user testing. So whenever we develop a new feature or even a new product, we like to test the features and functionality by watching how users actually interact with them. And we've also got a whole heap of data that we generate from the use of our online products that we can subject to statistical analysis. So just to give you an example of the kinds of results that we get off the back of that. We recently took a look at the recommendations that go alongside the resources that we have for our online toolkit. So it's a website with lots of useful content, and alongside that is, for each piece of content, we want to be able to recommend useful additional reading or other resources that are there. And one of the questions that we had was, at the time, editors were essentially authoring these links based on their own expertise and the knowledge of the corpus of content that we had. But there was a sense from the technical team in particular that could be replaced by some kind of smart algorithm that identified relevant content. And that would do a couple of things. One would be it would improve the relevance of the results, but it would also cut down significantly the amount of time that was taken to produce them. So rather than just make the decision to go ahead and replace the authored links, what we wanted to do was carry out what's called an A/B test. So we for half the population of users that we had they were getting the traditional recommendations, and for the other half they were getting the recommendations that were being generated by this smart algorithm that the guys had developed. And the overall result of that was, when we went through the analysis, was that actually the first go around, the links that were authored by the editors were actually more successful. More people tended to click through and want to look at the additional resources that were being recommended. But on the second and third tries, as the algorithm improved, it became very clear that actually the recommendations weren't just as good as, but were in fact more relevant to those particular users. So Janet, I think, hi there, how are you?
Hi, how are you? Craig apparently just dropped off
I know.
there.
Was saying he was using hotel Wi-Fi, so I suspect that might be part of the reason.
He's coming back in, so yeah, I kind of rudely came in late, but...
Hello.
Yeah, I dropped out now. I'm here. Sorry for that. It dropped me out. Until Janet dropped in, I was kind of feeling comfortable. I thought, look, here's Craig, and there's Owen, who knows about research and data, and he doesn't mind me saying this, he's a bit nerdy about it, but I felt I could handle that. I felt comfortable. Now Janet's here, and all of a sudden, the scales are tipping away from my favour. Starting to feel a little less comfortable. So thanks for joining us, Janet. I hope another data newbie can join the call and even things out.
Well, I would say, do you want me to leave? You know, I can do it.
No, please don't. You're the only one that's here. Please don't leave. So, Owen, before I just disappeared into the ether, you used the words, not in the same senses, but you used the word research.
Yeah.
You used the word data. And I often see these words being used in the same conversation. Are they the same thing? Or are they subtly different? Does it matter?
Does it matter? Is it just semantics? I guess this is what you're asking. So all research produces data, whether that's qualitative data or quantitative data. But I'd say research is as much about the methods as it is about the result. So how you get the data, the protocols that you follow to remove bias in your samples, in your conclusions, are as important as the actual results. So it's in fact, you could almost argue that the methodology, well, I would argue the methodology is as important as the data that comes off the back of it, because if you've got flawed methodology, the data's useless. So research is kind of all-encompassing. It covers everything from sort of the initial hypothesis all the way through to the sort of the data and the conclusions that are sort of fall off the back of that. Data is just the kind of the initial output that still needs to be analysed and interpreted.
Okay, thank you. Picking up on words again, you're going to be very careful with what you say from now on, because I'm probing into the words here and there. But for anybody listening in, qualitative and quantitative, what's the difference for those people that are kind of new to the data and the research world? What's the difference between the two? Does that matter?
Yeah, well, it does it. They're different things for different purposes. So qualitative data tends to be more descriptive, whereas quantitative data is something that can easily be measured in some way, shape, or form, usually involving numbers of some sort. So to give you an example of where we've gone down the route of looking at the quantitative data at the expense of useful qualitative data or information. This is going back a number of years now, but it taught us a harsh lesson. So if you imagine the core product that we have is an online toolkit that an online website that that has lots of resources to help managers do their jobs more effectively, and it's got somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 resources, and it's it's a very nice functional website that's been designed specifically to make it easy for people to use. But there is a lot of content in there, and we had noticed that somewhere between 8 and 12% of the people who came onto the site were using the search function. So, which is quite low for a website that has such a large amount of content to find. So we wanted to go and improve the search function. So we did lots of things. We wanted to improve the search algorithm and the way that we identified. We wanted to make the search results more relevant, and so the way that we tested whether we were getting there was essentially we showed lots of users lots of lists of content for common search terms. So we did a piece of analysis to find out some common search terms, and then we had algorithms that produced two subtly different lists, and we asked people which one was more relevant, and we did that lots and lots of times. And as you slowly but surely improve and tweak all the sort of levers that you've got within the algorithm, the results become more and more relevant. So we did that. But we also looked at the design of the search. So we looked at whether it made a difference about where the search was positioned. The search is in the top right-hand corner where you would expect it, but maybe our website was unusual, and so we tried moving it to the left-hand side. We put it in the center. We made the search box bigger, and nothing really changed that much, irrespective of, and again, we looked at the results based on not returning users but new users to the site, and still somewhere between 8 and 12% of people were using the search. And then we carried out one of our sort of regular rounds of user testing, and which is essentially you put the product in front of users and you ask them to carry out some common tasks. Think about a management challenge that you had recently. Find a piece of content to help you with that. And we noticed again that the vast majority of them were just using the navigation menus. And so we thought to ask the question, why is it that you're not using the search? And they simply said, it's really easy to find the content using the navigation. I prefer using that. So qualitative data, the user testing and asking questions and probing; quantitative data, the analytics and the stats that we got from the site. And so there's benefit and value in both of them, because the example that I was talking about previously about the relevance of the recommendations, how good the recommendations were, we wouldn't be able to get that kind of improvement by relying purely on qualitative information. We needed to actually get the data in terms of the volume of people going through the process of looking at content and clicking on the recommendation links. So hopefully that gives that's a useful example.
it certainly helps me to get a specific example about qualitative and quantitative. I kind of knew the answers in my head, but you've provided a good schema there, a good real-world example I think people can relate to help split out the two. Moving forward, we've got Janet's joined the call now. Janet is the data scientist here at HT2, so it would seem surely not to say, given that we've got a small audience here today, Janet, please feel free to chip in and either fire some really tough questions at Owen or answer the really easy questions that I'm asking. It's up to you. It's up to you. So
Owen, one thing that you brought up that that I think is probably worth talking about a little bit more is the importance of methodology, because even something as simple as an A/B test can be done quite poorly, and I didn't know if you had any examples of how to do it well or what not to do, because I think that's a really important thing when people are getting started in research.
I love that question, Jan. I was going to ask a similar one, which was you're obviously you've got a research and a data-minded head on you, Owen, and obviously we've got that skill set in HT2 with Janet. But what about anyone that's listening to this that doesn't? What about anyone that's in this that's a lone L&D practitioner in their team, or just part of a Joe average L&D team? To ride off the back of Janet's great question, what can people do? Where can they start? What's the best starting point for just somebody who knows that they need to do some research but doesn't have that experience or perhaps that skill set to dive in and do the things that perhaps we're talking about?
So, I suppose I would maybe separate the two of them out. There are some pitfalls that you can go down in terms of an A/B test. Some of that is down to are you sufficiently randomizing the people who are exposed to the two different conditions. Part of that is down to are you testing against the two conditions correctly? So, and by that I mean maybe the best analogy is to give from a medical perspective, because people can align with that a bit more easily. So, when you're testing a new drug, let's say that there's a new painkiller. What a lot of people think should happen is that you randomly assign the new painkiller to people and then give the rest of the population, the control group, if you will, a placebo. But what you're testing there is whether the drug is effective at all. But painkillers already exist, so you need to be testing against the existing treatment, if you will. So to pull that back to an A/B test, there is no point in simply testing two brand new ways of doing something if you've already got something that's in place. So if, for example, you have you already have a design for an online resource, rather than test two new different designs, you need to at least test against the existing design as well. So there are a number of sort of methodology pitfalls that you can fall down, but the vast majority of the time these are solved problems already. So web development companies in particular have written quite extensively about how they go about doing that and the kinds of mistakes that they've made, but also you can draw on from other domains. And I mentioned the medical profession. They've made just about every mistake it's possible to make, but they have learned from them, and they're constantly looking at how they go about improving them. So Janet, I don't know if that's answered your question. I'm quite sure that you've got some additional points that are worth making.
Well, yeah, but I didn't want to jump in while you're answering, because I know Craig, I think, brings up a good point. But I think, yeah, to me, a lot of methodology is definitely cribbing off the notes of relevant fields, because people have put such a body of work into this, and there's no point in relearning what somebody else has already done the hard work to figure out.
Yeah, absolutely. And Craig, in terms of you were talking about in terms of where do people start if they want to carry out their own research. I'd say a first step would be to familiarize yourself with all the mistakes that it's really easy to make. So, there's plenty of literature out there on cognitive biases, on sample bias, and really just starting right at the basics of the scientific method. That is, that's how we go about finding out whether something works or not. The idea of, generating a hypothesis, creating or establishing how you will find, and the hypothesis needs to be falsifiable. So quite often people will carry out research without testing against something that is actually falsifiable. They're just looking for a way to confirm their own hunches or suspicions. You need to be able to define how that hypothesis would fail as a result of the experiment that you're going to conduct. And then, as Janet says, there are lots of mistakes that you can make in terms of the sort of the experiment design, the methodology that's there. But a lot of them have already been, they've already been uncovered. And in terms of a starting point, it's about finding a question that you want the answer to where there isn't already good quality evidence. So there's an awful lot of literature out there, especially in the learning domain, not necessarily about applying learning into a performance situation. I have to say, some of there are some weaknesses in the sort of the evidence there, but certainly in terms of what helps people to retain information, there's lots of good quality evidence that's already out there. So, look in your own context, find a question that you want to answer, and then turn that into a hypothesis, something that can be shown to be false, and then work from there to determine what your methodology is going to be. And the other thing that I would say is that at good practice, we make a judgment call as to what constitutes good enough evidence. So quite a bit of the research that we carry out, I think if you were to show it to an academic, they would turn around and say, well, that will never get published. Well, our aim isn't necessarily to get published. Our aim is to help push forward the products and the services that we've got. So we make a judgment call in terms of what's good enough evidence. It's not quite the same bar that needs to be crossed if, for example, you're wanting to introduce a new cancer treatment.
Yeah. And I wanted to kind of echo what you were saying about having hypotheses that are falsifiable, because I think, from a very young age, we're kind of taught, when we answer a question, prove yourself right. And, as school children or in the workplace, it's always showing that you're right, and that is the path to bias in sampling and bias in method. It's just your first step to it. And so I think, for me, that was one of the most important things I learned in research, was to have more than one hypothesis going at a time and then trying to prove myself wrong. And I think that one of the things to me about looking at how to falsify a hypothesis is it gets you really conscious of what evidence you have is diagnostic or not. And by which I mean, Craig, because I'm throwing around words again too, sorry, that, for example, if, to take it to a health thing, if one of my kids is ill and I'm trying to figure out what they have, things like a fever and stuff, that could validate a whole bunch of different illnesses. But if they're not covered with a rash, they probably don't have chicken pox. I can toss that one out. So I think as you're looking at your hypotheses, if you can say which things are actually going to be diagnostic and distinguish one result from another, because some things will be true for a lot of different cases. So I think that's where that view of looking at how to disprove things really can be a tremendous help.
Yeah, and they're also the most useful things, because you don't want to be going down a path where you're operating on an incorrect assumption simply because you've gathered evidence in a way that's kind of confirmed your own hunches or suspicions, and then you go down a particular path. Ultimately that's going to end in something that is at the very least subpar, and at worst actually detrimental to what it is that you're trying to achieve. And I think, we have made a whole bunch of mistakes along the way. I remember there was a time where what were they called? Tag clouds were the cool in thing, Web 2.0 thing. As a you could turn a sort of a list with a frequency list. So keyword frequency, for example, you could turn that into a tag cloud where the ones that were most frequent were bigger, and you saw that on things like Flickr and Delicious and various different websites. And we thought that this was obviously because so many other sites were using it, it must be a really good tool to help people discover content. And so we built in a feature, and we just went ahead on that assumption, and it was that kind of faulty reasoning that we ended up with something that we found people didn't use, and actually people much preferred just looking at a list with numbers against them as opposed to this clever tag cloud. So there are all kinds of ways where you draw upon sort of your own experience of the world where you could be led down a wrong path.
Oh, you made a couple of minutes ago, and you mentioned about, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting what you said here, about doing research just to confirm your own suspicions and gut feelings. Well, I've got a question about that. It was one that I was going to ask anyway, but I'm pleased you kind of set the frame for that. I want to give a little anecdote beforehand, though. A few years ago, I was working for Food International, and we were looking at how we basically stopped just delivering courses face-to-face or online and moved into the world that that many other people were in, but more people wanted to get into. I had a gut feeling about what we should be doing, but I didn't follow that gut feeling. What I did was we worked towards maturity. We got them to come in, and we got them to do the very first learner landscape survey with us, and it went brilliantly. Buy-in from the top, 60-odd% return rate for a survey that had no extrinsic motivator and what they didn't have to do. Really good turnout. And of course the results, where this is going, the results almost to a letter confirmed my gut feeling about what we should be doing. So I guess my question here, which I finally figure out what the hell it is do gut feelings have a place to play in this research, data, scientific world? Do they have a part in there or not? And if they do, what is it?
Yeah, of course they do. So one of the things that we say here is that our expertise and our intuition inform what it is that we would like to test. They inform the hypotheses that we come up with, but testing your intuition against reality is the key, because it's simply not possible to tell the difference between a good gut feeling and misleading gut feelings. You just cannot tell. And one of the other things that we tend to say here is that we have 2 or 3 brilliant ideas every week, of which 70% turn out to be rubbish, because we test them against reality, and it's very easy, I think, to get lulled into a sense of security by looking back at the hunches that you have had that turn out to be right. You do tend to ignore the hunches that you've had where you've been completely wrong. And the example I gave you there about the interpreting the quantitative data on the search on our site is a perfect example of that, where we did end up with a much better search, but it wasn't as important as perhaps we thought it was. So yeah, there is a place for gut feeling, especially when you've been operating in a particular domain for a reasonable amount of time. Your hunches, your gut feelings tend to get better, but you still need to test that against reality. And the other thing that I would mention, Craig, is that it is, especially when it comes to things like surveys, it is as important to try and reach out to the people that have not responded for whatever reason as it is to look at the data that you're getting from the people that have responded. So, which is one of the things that I quite like about the success case method that Brinkerhoff recommends. Yeah, he's because he does say that. He's like you're getting responses from people who are either enthusiastic enough to offer an opinion, or antagonistic enough to offer an opinion. But the people who fall somewhere in between, in the I can't be bothered filling out the survey for whatever reason, are the ones that you really need to reach out to. So, and again, that is an example of a methodology where he's essentially taking good practice from a whole range of other domains and using it in a sort of learning specific context.
Well, thank you, Owen. I've a question here I'm going to fire this at both of you, if I may. Have you ever undertaken any research that's surprised, disappointed, frustrated you? And it might be unfair because despite what you've just said, Owen, I'm probably, in the past I've been guilty of going down a research path because I hope that's the result. I really hope that proves my point. On some occasions it hasn't. Admittedly, on some occasions it hasn't. What sticks in your mind that the result you got at the end just wasn't what you'd expected?
So I don't know if it was necessarily, it wasn't what I expected. It was surprising. So yeah, it wasn't quite what I expected. So one of the key challenges that we face when we're promoting sort of any online solution, really, where there's not any kind of compulsion behind engaging with it. So it is, it's free choice to access and make use of it. Is how do you create awareness? How do you promote that within the organisation? And so we've been around long enough, thankfully, to have carried out a whole range of promotional activities, from having specific events where people are there's demonstrations, and there's lots of promotional flyers and posters around, etc., all the way through to purely online digital communications. And so we did a piece of analysis looking at a lot of the activity that we were carrying out to find out what caused sustained increases in engagement and access to the online resources that we've got, and we found that actually the vast majority of what resulted was a big spike and then a drop back to normal patterns. And it didn't really matter whether it was face-to-face events or it was online demonstrations. But we did introduce a regular email, a digest, effectively, that highlighted new content, what content other people were looking at, some other various bits and pieces. It'd ask you to recommend a piece of content if you liked it from the last piece that you had looked at, and we went about that in quite a structured way. So we sent it out in different frequencies to different users. Some users received that on a monthly basis, some on a fortnightly basis, some on a weekly basis, and some more frequently than weekly. And what we were looking at was what resulted in outside of event engagement. So which type of frequency tended to result in people accessing the online resource other than when they were being prompted by the email itself, because you will always see a spike when someone gets an email being sent out, but do you see a change in behaviour over time? And what we found was that monthly emails didn't make any difference, fortnightly emails didn't make any difference. Weekly emails, you then started to see a significant and sustained increase in engagement, and then more frequently than weekly. Actually, what that resulted in was a similar pattern in terms of increased engagement, but more people unsubscribing from the email. So it was So we were surprised that it was so effective, because it really was. I mean, the difference was significant. But also slightly disappointed because email is such a old-fashioned tool. It was almost disappointing that email was so effective, because when we tried out with other social channels, so clients who have got Yammer, for example, we just didn't see the same kind of sustained increase in engagement. It really was. The impact of an email is astonishing.
I've seen you speak at quite a few events, Owen, and on more than a few of them, you use that anecdote about the email and you know, you say that love them or loathe them, they've been around for decades. We've, you know, billions has been spent around the world in thinking of different ways of removing email, but they still have a place to play. And if they didn't, the likes of Amazon and Twitter and Facebook wouldn't be sending out email, or wouldn't have the option for email digests to land with you if they hadn't done the research to show that they work. So yeah, that story there about the email, as soon as you started going down that route, I thought, ah, yes, it's the email research. And I'm pleased to hear it again, because it just drives that point home that it kind of works. It works.
Yeah, and it is so uncool. You know, it's not faddy in any way, shape, or form. And if we found a more effective method, I would be delighted. But yeah, that wasn't particularly great. But Janet,
what about yourself, Janet?
Well, you know, I think yeah, you know, there are always unexpected results. If I ever go into research and don't get unexpected results, I'll probably be quite unhappy. Because a big part of it is, I think any kind of research you do, it helps if you're like that rather poorly behaved 4 or 5-year-old child that I used to be, who was so delighted, you know, when something would break, because, you know, a clock or something, because that meant you could take it apart and, you know, and dig into it. And I think, you know, that kind of attitude serves you well in research, to just be open to, yes, be methodical, but be open to the unexpected. And I think that, you know, there's a lot of stuff that's been coming up in the last 6 months as we've been doing work with text analytics, of things that haven't worked, both in the sense of thinking, well, here's a methodology, here's a combination of factors that's going to give us a result, and then finding that no, really doing these much more complicated analyses.
Hi, Jack. So you.
Hello?
Yeah, hey, I lost you for a second.
well, we lost you, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. Just everything seemed to freeze up. Yeah. But so you know, we were, you know, doing the more complex analyses was not really bringing us better results, and that was somewhat disappointing as we were looking at how to refine things. Now that continues to evolve, and you know, Craig, you and I have talked about how, you know, some of the results that we're seeing about what leads people to engagement, we're finding some rather unexpected things of that. But the upside of this is that as I'm doing this and not always getting the results I want, I've gotten in so much more deeply in the course design, in the kinds of questions that are being asked, that what's really coming out of this isn't just what I was looking for, but a much better understanding of what are the things we need to continue to look into to improve design, to improve that engagement, that are things that I wouldn't have thought of if I hadn't gotten into this mire of things that weren't working. Now, I think the difficult thing for a practitioner is, you know, it's really nice for me where, you know, Ben gives me pretty much and Alan give me pretty much a free head to say, well, go chase down these rabbit trails. But I know if I were a practitioner in a corporation, you know, my stakeholders are going to be coming to me with very specific questions that they want, and with specific answers that they are expecting to get to those questions, or hoping to get, but that means they're really assuming you're going to bring the right answers to the discussion, who are not really informed on learning, on cognitive science, on habit, on any of these things that, you know, that are going to lead to performance that learning professionals are going to be aware of. And so I think one of the big struggles, if you're a practitioner going into research, and I don't have the perfect answer for this, but it's something I think about quite a lot, is how do we help to formulate questions to drive the conversation with our leadership, so that if we're presenting them with research, we're presenting them with data, we're guiding them to the information they need, not the information that they've decided they want, whether it's the right information or not.
So, I mean, it's a tenuous link, I'm sorry, but kind of leading on for that desire for to be able to have better conversations with our senior leadership team to help and guide and coach them. It could perhaps be linked to my next question. If it isn't, then feel free to answer your own question. What one piece of research do you wish Joe average L&D practitioner would pay more attention to? It might be a piece of research about research. We talked about that earlier on, about looking at the, the research about cognitive bias. It might be a piece of research that's not actually on a meta level about research. So what one piece do you wish and hope and pray more people would pay attention to? Go on then, Owen.
Do you know, it's like, picking a favourite child. I couldn't possibly narrow it down to just one. And equally, if I reflect on it, would you want doctors to reduce their focus in that way to just a single piece of research?
If it meant that my hernia got operated on any bloody quicker, yes, I would. But I'm going off on one now, so move away from
I think that's healthcare rather than medical science. I would suggest that's to blame for that. I mean, there's the obvious one, which is the kind of the research that's being conducted on learning styles. There's a myth that would do well to go. I think it's a damaging concept in and of itself. But there's lots of stuff on research on memory, on learning and retention. I brought along a prop. I think this book, Make It Stick, by Peter Brown, Henry Rodinger and Mark McDaniel. I think that's an excellent summary of our current state of understanding about learning and retention. I think that's useful. But I would probably, there's an example, there's quite a well-known study that I think exemplifies why carrying out research is important, and it's nice. It fits nicely into kind of the sphere that learning professionals will be familiar with. It's also extremely robust and has been replicated a good number of times. So there's something called the Forer effect, which was carried out by a guy called Bertrand Forer. The initial study was Bertrand Forer in the 1950s. And he gave his students a personality assessment. One of these assessments where you answered a series of questions about yourself, and then they handed it in, and he provided them all with the response to the assessment, and asked them to rate it. So essentially, it was a personality profile based on their responses to the series of questions that he had asked them, and he asked them to rate it on a scale of 1 to 5 in terms of how accurately they felt that it described them and their personality, and it was scored something in the region of, it was like 4.5 out of 5 was the average score. But what he had done is he had taken cuttings from a horoscope magazine and constructed this description, this personality profile, from statements that were made in horoscopes, and everyone got the same personality profile. And so essentially what that demonstrates, I think, is that, and the reason behind it was that people tend to, a lot of the statements were very vague. They could apply to a wide population of people. People tended to focus on the more positive statements rather than the negative statements. The proportion of positive statements was higher than the proportion of negative statements. And so it's very easy to create something that seems like it's very specific, but actually isn't at all. And so there are a lot of personality tools out there that essentially replicate what he did, but have turned it into a tool that's being purchased by and used in organizations throughout the world.
A Ponzi scheme, as Don Clark would call them.
Well, yes, exactly. And so, there was a very neat experiment, wasn't it? Is it possible to create a personality profile that would be acceptable to a large proportion of the audience that were there, and even though they all answered the questions differently, they were able to say, oh yes, this describes me specifically very accurately.
Oh, yeah. What about yourself?
I'm gonna kind of step away from the specific learning things I might say, but I'm gonna say two kind of meta level things. One is if you want to go really, really, really nerdy, geeky, dig deep into it, looking at fields like medical research or even more so econometrics for models for research design. Econometrics is fabulous because it's, and to me, so analogous to learning, as is medical, because you have a lot of variables. You can't really control a lot of the variables you have, so you're having to get into the realm of empirical. You're working with quantitative and qualitative together, and so they've really developed interesting models for how to get valid research and valid data out of that. And these are really complicated, so these are not like for the necessarily the casual, I'm just getting started in research. But if you want, if you're into it and you want to dig in deeper, there's a book, Mostly Harmless Econometrics, which is probably the easiest introduction to it that I can come up with. And I think if you want to take a similar approach or be looking at that kind of line of thought but not get quite that deep, the whole concept of uplift modeling, which is big in sales, and I think ties into some of the things that Owen was talking about, even with the research they've done, of where you're saying, okay, if I change this, how is this going to improve retention or performance or engagement? But we have to say, we have to look at it in that context of, but what would have changed anyway? In sales, uplift modeling is saying, well, if I send out this, this flyer to people in the mail, or if I run this advertising campaign, what's the increase in sales? But you have to project how many people would have bought at this time anyway, right? And in learning, we have to always be looking at that same thing, and that's kind of a first step getting into that realm of thought of saying, how do we manage these problems where it's not like when you're doing science in the lab and you can have a control that you can have everything be the same except for the one thing that you're changing. You're dealing with 1,000 learners. You've got 1,000 things for each of those 1,000 learners that are different, and so you have to figure out how to work validly. So I think for me, if you're doing research outside of the so important understanding of how people learn and how they understand and how they remember, it's figuring out how can we model and measure things in such a complex system. And some things are much easier than others. But to always be kind of keeping in mind of what are the things that we can do to account for, even when you're talking about in the school systems where you're saying, well, how do different students perform? Well, what's the teacher in the classroom? What's their home life? What's their, all those sorts of things. And people in the workplace, who's been only got 3 hours of sleep last night because they had a sick child who just got a fabulous performance review and is at on the top of the world, and who just got stuck with a pile of work that's making them crazy. And if all of them sit down in front of some learning at the same time, that's going to affect the results. Yeah, exactly. That's going to affect the results, right? So to say, how do we start modeling around that? And there's no one easy answer, but that's the thing that I think right now is the most in the back of my mind when I'm working.
Cool, thank you. I've dropped some links that both of you have mentioned into the I don't know why, because there's only the three of us on here, then it's your content, but I've dropped the links in anyway because it's habit. We've mentioned habit, haven't we? Mm-hmm. See what we did there, children. I'm going to cheat now and I'm going to answer my own question, which is very, very tenuously linked to research. There was research behind it, but it's not a research paper as such. It's a book. It's a very easy to digest book because I've read it a couple of times, but there's significant research that sits behind it. And that book, and I know that Owen is aware of this, and I'm sure Janet is the Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande. And that dips in and out of, just enough for me, the subject of research is to the research that he did across a number of US hospitals and then across a number of the World Health Organization establishments into just how effective and when and where and how something as simple as a physical checklist could be in minimizing poor examples of healthcare. And particularly, I think line insertions was what he focused around. So it's not the research paper itself. It's a very light touch, smattering about what took place, I'm sure, was incredibly detailed. And I wanted to mention that because you've both mentioned medical here, and I think you're absolutely right at the beginning. It's something that people can wrap their heads around and align with, because we're all human beings. We all have uplifts in health, and we all have downsides. So I wanted to try it and add something on there. So my recommendation would be to go and have a look at that book, The Checklist Manifesto by Asfel. And it does touch on different research methods in there, very, very lightly, I must admit. And it was just enough for me. But it does touch on different research methods and what people came back with, and the challenges they had around some of those. But thank you for your contributions, very definitely. So we are approaching the half hour. I wanted to ask if you guys wanted to add anything else that we've not covered here, anything that you wish people would go and look at, any words of warning or words of caution, perhaps hard-earned over your years of data and research, before we bring things to a halt.
Well, we have reflected on, and we've both mentioned the medical profession. And the reason why we kind of keep coming back to it is because medicine is more often than not literally a matter of life and death. It gets concentrated on quite heavily by a lot of clever people, and so they are in a lot of ways ahead of the game. And so I would recommend, if people want to get a really good basic overview of research in that area, there's a couple of books by Ben Goldacre. First one's Bad Science, and it just gives a really nice overview of why it's important to conduct research and trials in particular. And the second one is Bad Pharma, which is a much more in-depth look. It deals with a lot more complicated issues, but again highlights the kind of pitfalls, or actually what it does is it shows you how the pharmaceutical industry has sometimes skewed the research base in a particular direction, and the methods that they go about doing that, and also how you can identify when that's happening. And both of those books uncover or describe techniques that can be used across a whole range of different domains. And in fact, we're actually seeing that just now. A lot of the debate that is happening or has happened in medical science, you're starting to see that come through in terms of psychology research, for example. So both are looking at problems with publication bias and all that kind of stuff. And so so really, both those books are fascinating but incredibly relatable sort of digest.
Thank you, Owen. Thank you. And I've dropped those two links, Bad Pharma and Bad Medicine, into the chat panel here so that you can go and look at them if you've read them. What about yourself, John? Any closing comments before we draw things to a conclusion?
Yeah, I think the one thing is, it's not just how well you research, it's how you deliver it, how you present it. Both presenting it, understanding your audience, knowing how they'll hear it, knowing what's the language that will cause them to sit up and listen, but also to take care that you don't present things in such a way that you're actually clouding the waters. Infographics are kind of notorious, and you can Google some really nice sites of misleading infographics where it looks like there's something that's really good data and it's extraordinarily misleading. And so just how you deliver it, how you present it is gonna impact how valid and how credible what you're saying is.
There's a good site called Junk Charts by I think the guy who runs it is a data scientist, but he essentially looks at a lot of charts that sometimes appear in the media, and he essentially identifies what's wrong with them. Sometimes it's because they're not presenting data in the best way. Sometimes it's because they're deliberately misleading, and he kind of deconstructs, and then he produces an example of, look, this is how I would represent this data. This is a more reasonable or understandable example of that. And I think you're absolutely right, Janet. How you present that information is absolutely vital in terms of how A, how credible it is, but B, how easily understood it is by an audience.
I think I just found that on it's a typepad site, junkcharts.com. Again, I've dropped that, and I'll share these links outside of this Hangout afterwards, so that it's not just the three of us that get the benefit of them. So thank you, guys. As always, it's just gone 20:30. Want to say, I want to say a huge thank you for Owen for getting involved and staying behind after work this evening. I know you've had a crazy day today with online sessions and board meetings and things, so thank you ever so much for finding the time and fitting this in. Janet, my stalwart attendee, not only thank you for turning up and being an attendee, but thank you for allowing me to hurl the questions at you as well. And of course, I wouldn't have done it to just anybody, but it would have been such a shame not to get your insight into your background and what you do for us here at HT2. So thank you to both parties. Really, really well done. Thanks, guys.
That's great. It's a pleasure. Okay. Thank you.